Welcome to the Tom Woods Show, episode 316. Well, it was bound to happen. An episode on roads. And joining us to talk about roads is economist Bob Murphy. Robert P. Murphy blogs at consultingbyrpm.com. He holds a PhD in economics from New York University. He is the author of Lessons for the Young Economist, a free textbook for students like late junior high, early high school students. It also has a free teacher's guide. We will link to that at tomwoods.com/316, which is the show notes page for this episode. Also, Bob has written study guides for Human Action and Man, Economy, and State by Murray Rothbard, and The Theory of Money and Credit by Ludwig von Mises. We'll link to all of those at tomwoods.com/316. He's also the author of The Politically Incorrect Guide to Capitalism and The Politically Incorrect Guide to the Great Depression and the New Deal. Those books are available in audio form as well. And remember, you are entitled to one free audiobook, including one of those, via the offer that you can reach through tomwoodsaudio.com. Bob, welcome back to the show.
Thanks for having me, Tom. Always a pleasure.
It was inevitable, right? At some point, the roads had to come up as a subject. I think I've talked to Walter about this a little bit on the show at one point, Walter Block, of course. But at one point or another, the subject had to come up. May as well be today. And you sent me a post over on Reddit. Apparently there's an anti-libertarian Reddit forum, or maybe, I don't know, maybe there were 100 of them for all I know, but somebody posted something about his experience with private roads. And it's a laundry list of complaints about private roads, and followed by his conclusion, which is, given all these terrible aspects of private roads, you've got to be kidding me, being a libertarian proposing that this could be your actual solution to the road issue. So when you sent that to me, I thought, all right, well, you know what? Let's make a show out of it. Let's go through here. Let's start with the big picture. Give me the big picture of the issue of roads and this particular person. I think he's writing under a pseudonym, so we're not being disrespectful when we don't use his name. It's not that we're trying not to mention him. We have no idea who he is, right?
Right, exactly, yeah. Just the background on this, the only reason I thought it worthwhile sending to you is that I saw a prominent progressive blogger, economist, tweet this out to his fans, sort of haughty, like, ha, this guy really blew up these libertarian idiots. And it got a bunch of likes and so forth, favorites, whatever it is on Twitter. And so that's what made me click on it to see, a stunning, refutation of our views on roads. And as I was saying to you before the show here, Tom, except for the sarcasm and the snark, I mean, this is actually a good first-hand account of how the private sector can provide roads. And so it's sort of astonishing to me, and we can sit there and comb through it, and we'll get to it, I suppose, that the things where we bend over backwards and say, I guess he kind of has a point here, but even there, it's pretty easy just to show, well, no, that's actually a strike against the government and not against private markets.
Let me make sure everybody knows that you can click on and view this post on the show notes page. I'll put it up at tomwoods.com/316 so you can read along for yourselves. This guy has been has had some experience apparently in logging and forestry and timber and etc. And so that's where he's had experience in this area.
Right. So the way he starts his rant, or whatever you want to call it here on Reddit, is he says, look, it's become some sort of inside joke among libertarians dealing with the road question, but such that they don't even bother talking about it anymore. They just think it's a laugh line and they move on. But actually, this is a serious issue, and there's lots of problems with the private provision of roads. And I know from firsthand experience, because I spent some years in the logging industry, and there's all sorts of privately owned roads that timber companies maintain in order to get to the forest and get it out to the mills and so forth. And so his angle is to sort of like condemn libertarians for having this joke about who would build the road. He's making it sound like the libertarians are ignorant of the fact that the private sector maintains all sorts of roads right now, and that it's the libertarians' fault. And so right away, I just want to be clear, it's not a straw man. When we joke about who would build the roads, I have literally had relatives, when they hear my views, say to me, and they're not saying it to be combative, they're genuinely asking me, but Bob, if there were no taxes and no government, who would build the roads? They mean that sincerely. So this isn't a straw man for us to deal with that issue on that basic term. And then, certainly we can go in and out and look at the guy's specific complaints, but I think right there, that's a slam dunk case to say, look, we're no longer arguing about will there be roads or not, as many statists imply would be the outcome. Now we're just arguing about, are the roads under a private market provision approach better or worse than the ones that the state is currently providing? And so, because this guy's conceding that the private sector certainly can produce roads.
All right, so that's half the battle, as you say, is showing that this isn't just some theoretical thing that you and I are spinning for fun, but that that you don't have to go back to 19th century toll roads to see examples of private roads, that you can actually see a great many of them existing right now. If you can get that concession, well, then really you are bickering over details after that. Then it's a question of, what are these roads like? Are they better or worse? Are they more expensive, less expensive? You can ask about questions like that.
Right, and so like I said, what kind of annoyed me was he was making it sound like it was the Libertarians' fault for questioning whether the market could produce roads at all, and of course that wasn't. The reason we say who would build a road, it's not like Murray Rothbard just out of the blue entertained this notion to knock it out of the park. The reason we make that joke, who would build the roads, is because so many people say to us, who would build the roads, That's why it's a joke. So, besides the annoyance of him trying to spin it as if somehow that's our fault that we get asked that question all the time, you're right. It's half the battle right there, because I think for most people, especially with things like private provision of law or things like that, it's more of a conceptual issue. They understand how some raw, well-defined commodity could easily be produced by private competing businesses much more efficiently and humanely than by a monopoly state. It's just with certain types of network goods or things that it seems like you need the whole system in one fell swoop, otherwise it doesn't work. That's what, for a lot of people, provides a conceptual stumbling block. And so you're right. The fact that he's conceding right now there are extensive networks of privately built and owned and regulated, in quotation marks, roads in the current United States, right there, that I think for a lot of people would make them say, oh, so maybe this, Rothbardian idea isn't so utopian after all.
Let's talk about some of his specifics here. Toward the very end, he says that the whole thing is laughable, that private industry could take care of all our transportation needs. And he says one of the reasons that it's laughable is how expensive it is, and that would be especially difficult if you don't have eminent domain. So, yeah, if you don't have the power to just tell people to cough up their property, gosh, things are a lot harder. I don't know how, Bob, the private sector builds shopping malls or buildings of any sort or really anything, because, after all, it'd be a heck of a lot cheaper if they just had the power to force everybody to evacuate the existing buildings.
Right, and it is funny how there is the selective concern over individual property rights. Like a lot of progressives, leftists, are just shocked at the idea that the Keystone Pipeline, if that were to be built, why the government would just come in and give the rights to private industry to go and build pipelines through somebody's land, but the guy didn't want that. That horrifies them. But yet when it comes to building an interstate highway, all of a sudden, it's these rubes out there, these libertarians who insist that, if I own my land, that means bulldozers can't come through and kick me out and make me move. So it's, I don't know this particular guy. Maybe he's very consistent on this point, but certainly in general, when people bring up eminent domain, it depends what the issue is, whether they're for it or against it. I've noticed a lot. But back to this particular issue, you're right. One of his main objections, that's the thing, again, I'm reading this guy's whole rant here, and there's very little that even prima facie is an argument. It's mostly him just saying, yes, the private sector maintains thousands of miles of roads right now, and here's how it worked. But as far as why would we think that is a worse system than the state, to me, look, he has two main arguments. One of them was, like you say, that they're expensive. And, and he's got some vulgarity in there and so forth, saying, you wouldn't believe how expensive these things are. And even major corporations, the big timber logging companies, have trouble financing them. Okay, but again, just by giving the government the power to, or the authority or the responsibility of building something, doesn't all of a sudden make it cheaper. No, on the contrary, it makes it many times more expensive. And we know empirically that happens, and we also can theoretically explain why when political officials are in charge of dispersing funds to do something, the costs get escalated well above what would happen in a private sector analog. But beyond that, again, just how does the government pay for the roads? Well, right now, the interstates and so forth, I mean, they're financed by the primarily the federal gasoline tax, 18.4 cents a gallon. And there's this the Interstate Highway Fund, which was broke, at least as of going last August. There was a big conflict, and there was a debate over, gee, should we let the states charge tolls on the roads? Because right now, the rule had been individual states could charge tolls instead of toll booths and what have you. They wanted to build more lanes. But as far as the original infrastructure, like with Eisenhower and all that stuff, they were not allowed to charge tolls on it because, in theory, in other words, that would be like the federal government building something with federal dollars, letting the states use it, and then double dipping, and so that wasn't allowed. So the point is, there's billions of dollars, literally, that have already been taken from taxpayers that are getting put into maintaining the existing structure. So the question's not how could the private sector build a really expensive thing. I mean, the issue is, roads can be expensive. And do you think that the state or private businesses are more likely to contain costs and to build roads in an efficient manner?
Yeah, I mean, I think what he's kind of suggesting is, I wish the kinds of roads that I need to use for my profession could be subsidized. Then they would seem cheaper to me. But that's kind of a selfish, self-centered way to think about social problems. I think we need to think in terms of the needs of all of society. And when something is expensive, what that actually means conceptually is that the resources needed to produce it are very, very urgently demanded in other lines. There are other uses for those resources, and you better really be able to prove and demonstrate that the purposes for which you intend to use them are of very great importance. That's all it means for something to be expensive. So those resources necessary to make those roads don't suddenly become less urgently needed elsewhere simply because the government is directing the construction. It's the same fundamental problem of scarcity that we face either way. Now, go ahead.
I don't often disagree with you, Tom, but here I think you're giving him too much credit. I don't.
All right. On that, I'll concede. You can disagree.
Yeah. I think you made his point. You made his point coherent. I think he's just lamenting and saying, I cannot possibly imagine. In other words, if just these little gravel roads that go from the forest down to the mill, if that costs as much money as I've seen with my own eyes that it costs, and I've seen the sums involved, and I know it was really difficult for my firm to get the financing to just make that sort of crappy road that's good enough just to have a logging truck go over. Well, then I just can't even imagine how could they possibly pay for these beautiful interstate highways that I use when I go on a long road trip. It's just no. I mean, no private business has that much money. I think that's what his point was, that he just can't conceive of large companies being able to handle the volume of spending that he knows the U.S. federal government can handle. Which, if that is his point, again, you and I have to fill in the gaps here because he didn't really spell it out. But if that is his point, and I've seen people say all the time stuff about, talk about international space going sort of space exploration into outer space, things like that. Should we send a colony on Mars, that sort of thing. A lot of people just say point blank up front, well, clearly the government has to do that because private business couldn't afford it. And so everything you said, of course, is perfectly true, Tom, but I'm saying I think these people, they're not even getting to the level of sophistication you were attributing them. I think they just don't realize that the private sector is capable of raising billions of dollars for specific projects. And the other thing, too, is just to see how it's more manageable, it's not like there'd be one company that would be in charge of financing and constructing every single road in the current geographical United States. That's not what would happen. It would be distributed and decentralized so that there, perhaps the big shopping mall in a certain town would be the one that would underwrite the construction of all the little connecting roads for a few square miles around it, because it would just run the numbers and realize, it'll be easier if we just own this and maybe we have some ads occasionally, or and keep it free in quotation marks so people aren't having to pay tolls every 3 blocks in order to ease the flow of traffic into and out of our shopping mall. And we can charge our vendors more for renting space here because they know it's easy for customers to get in and out. There's various models that would happen, or large, what would be like our current interstate system. Surely, one company might own a few of those types of things, but it's not that there'd be one giant company that would have to finance hundreds of billions of dollars to just pave every single road surface in the country.
Well, also on that, in that regard, he has a snarky little aside where he says, I've never heard a libertarian explain how the cost would be managed in their ideal world. Remember, no large corporations exist without government in Libertopia. Ha ha, I know. So in other words, he's saying that apparently he thinks our argument is that, businesses only become big with the help of government. But although there is a wing of libertarianism that argues that, that is not by any means the mainstream view. I've never denied that you would have pretty big companies in a libertarian world. But also, when he's talking about the roads that are used by the logging industry and complaining that he wishes they could be of better quality and so forth, again, it's a failure to think economically here, because when he says that he wishes that the roads could be more luxurious than they are, what he's really saying is he wishes that resources could be siphoned off from some other present use and diverted to his industry. So he's got to be specific here. I want him to tell us what current use do these resources have that, in his judgment, his completely non-arbitrary judgment, of course, is less urgently needed than what he needs them for.
Right, well, he probably would tell you if you gave him another shot on Reddit.
Right, but again, we would see the completely arbitrary nature of this. We would all like whatever it is that we work with now to be of higher quality. The reason it isn't is that we can't command the resources. The reason we can't command the resources is that they're being commanded by people who have much greater consumer demand behind them and can command those resources. I mean, I'd love to be able to have the services of, 10 personal assistants during the day. But because labor is more urgently needed elsewhere, I can't command that labor. And that's okay. I don't sit around saying, well, therefore labor markets don't work, or we can't have private labor markets, we have to collectivize labor or something. I just recognize this is the nature of scarcity in the world.
Right, exactly. And that is what's so ironic about this lament, and when people say, oh, that's just too expensive. Private business couldn't possibly handle that. Again, resources don't magically multiply just because the government is in charge of it. It's like you said, there's this fundamental fact of scarcity, and if you want to divert more labor hours and concrete and steel and paint and what else have you, construction equipment into building roads, well, then that means those resources aren't available for something else. And it's precisely the decentralized private sector with property right, where you don't have the equivalent of eminent domain, that ensures the best possible allocation of those resources. Because not only this guy writing on Reddit, but neither Tom Woods nor Bob Murphy knows exactly where these resources ought to go. That's what you have the profit and loss system for. His other main complaint, again, both Tom, you and I have been scouring this thing, trying to figure out, what's the argument to attack here, is that he suggests the logging roads are very dangerous. And so, it horrifies him to think that they would do the same sort of thing to the general public as these libertarian nut jobs want. And so, and maybe you've seen it too on Facebook, people occasionally send around these like extreme videos that are real scary about, they mount a camera on a logging truck that's going up some really, death-defying, cliff-hanging road that's just hugging the side of a mountain or something, and it's very narrow. So I'm sure that there do exist very precarious roads in the logging industry, but again, look at the context there. It's because there are certain really inaccessible sites, and then they have to get that, to get the trucks from there down to the mill or wherever they're going ultimately. And yes, there is a cost-benefit trade-off. And so the question is, for this particular guy didn't die, obviously, and he didn't relate any personal grisly tales. I went and looked. I could not find any sort of apples-to-apples comparison about deaths per motorist on logging roads versus the general public, because clearly many thousands of people die all the time on government-owned roads, right? That's one of Walter Block's main points, that if private business had the death of its customers that governments have on government-owned roads, there would be a national outcry. There'd be commissions and so forth looking into this, and there'd be all sorts of penalties being imposed on these awful businesses that are killing their customers like crazy. But nobody thinks that when there's poorly designed public roads that allow, a drunk driver to kill a bunch of people, or that because the speed limits aren't what they should be, or because the off-ramp isn't designed properly, or they didn't put the right sort of signage at a certain intersection, and lots of people are dying there, but yet the politicians don't get around to fixing that. All those problems with public management, and I'm just using public, of course, really we mean state management, those are systematic things. The statistics for how many people die on government-owned roads are appalling. But anyway, what I found was in Washington State, I found this report on logging deaths in Washington State from 1998 to 2008, right? So for, I guess that'd be an 11-year period there, or a 10-year span, they break it down, and so far as I can tell, in terms of people who clearly died because of an accident that occurred while driving on a road, and it doesn't even specify a logging road. I mean, this could be that they, at this point, had gotten onto the interstate. It was a total of 10, right? So 1 per year in the state of Washington. And so, again, we don't know how many total drivers there were, and so proportionally, maybe that's a big number. I don't know. I couldn't find statistics to that effect. But again, the idea that the strike against this is that, oh my gosh, this is clearly way too dangerous, and we wouldn't want to voice this on the general public. Prima facie, it's not at all obvious that's the case. And again, it's not as if private businesses, when they were building something to be the analog of the interstate, would have something that would be a gravel road on the side of a mountain, right? The reason those gravel roads are on the side of a mountain is if you have to get logs from an inaccessible point to somewhere else, you're not going to build a 4-lane smooth highway.
Right, exactly. I mean, it seems a little strange to take this outlying example and try to suggest that, well, I guess Interstate 70 in Kansas would be a gravel road under these money-grubbing libertarians if they had their way.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I guess it would be like saying, look at the food that the astronauts on the Apollo missions had to eat.
Yeah.
You're telling me you want the government to have school lunches? Look at what they were eating up there in orbit. That's crazy. I mean, it's...
Yeah. Right, but it goes to show that there's a deep double standard at work with so many libertarian critics. When the funny thing is, they think we have a double standard and they're going to set us right. But when you talked about the Walter Block point about fatalities on the roads and the highways in particular, that is a great example of a double standard, because they being critics of us, treat those fatalities as if they're just some kind of force of nature that has no cause, or that surely we can't bother looking for one. These things are just going to happen. But if you're absolutely right, if they were taking place on private roads, it would be the fault of the private road owners, and indeed, as this guy is saying here, that it's the fault, that he doesn't say, well, look, it's a dangerous situation, the routes are dangerous, that's the nature of the thing, there's nothing you can do about it. He blames the private owners, but he never, ever blames the government owners for the same kind of situation. Let me point out also in here, he talks about security. He says security, because he goes through all these different factors that make these roads undesirable. He says security. Yep. Just like public roads, we have to pay for security to keep riffraff out. Another huge cost. How in the world is that an argument against private roads? Did we ever say that private roads wouldn't have to pay for security, or that they'd be cheap or whatever? That has nothing to do with the argument at all. Like, why does he think he's answering us there? Yes, of course. And he says, just like public roads. I know. So they're paying this expense too. Right.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, again, this could be Walter Block's student could use this as a first-hand account to show that, yeah, Walter's right. I mean, someone might say, oh, you couldn't have privately owned roads because without the government police protecting and providing security, you'd be helpless and everybody would be getting pulled over by bandits. And then this guy could say, well, no, actually, we did have privately provided security. They had to pay for it, of course. No, it's not like we had people protecting stuff and building gates for free, but we did have security. So, again, all these, the great thing to me, I mean, I actually learned something from this article. Realize how much the private sector had provided its own network of roads and all the things that would have to go along with it.
Let's bring up at least one more point here. Gates. He says, I can't tell you how many hours I spent unlocking, locking, and going through multiple and often redundant gates between property owners. And then he says, the thought of highway-level traffic volumes going through these roads is laughable. Okay, but is this again just a question of highway-level traffic wouldn't be going through a logging road on a route like that, so the comparison is not really a sensible one?
Right, exactly. I mean, for example, when I left college and then I was the interim period before I went to grad school, I lived in some sketchy neighborhoods in Chicago and then New York. In certain businesses, they were in high crime areas, and they would have procedures in place, like the employees would work behind bulletproof glass and things like that. They wouldn't take credit cards or a personal check, things like that, because clearly they had been burned in the past, or just they had read about what was happening in that neighborhood. So that's what they did. And so there, to me, that was beautiful. That was the market responding to the situation at hand in a wonderful way. And you might have thought it would cripple it, but no, look at the market adapted. And the same thing here, given the situation they face, that, what can they do? I mean, a lot of critics a priori might have said, well, gee, in a situation like this where, the police are completely inaccessible and so on, there just wouldn't be a road. Why would some company bother building a road when you couldn't? And they say, oh, well, no, you could have gates and things like that, and that's part of it. And he discusses all these ways of, paying for it, and how do they have easements and things like that, and look at all the negotiation that needs to take place when the company wants to come in and build a road, and how do they compensate the local landowners and things like that. So again, that's the market at work. I mean, if you saw a big company come in and hire a bunch of people to build, I don't know, a giant swimming pool or something, I could sit there and say, oh my gosh, do you know they had to strike up negotiations with all the workers and agree on how much they were going to pay them and so forth and what time they had to show up for work? I mean, that was just a big headache. I don't understand how the private sector can possibly build a swimming pool. I mean, look at all that negotiation that was involved. That's crazy.
What do you think is the overall case to make in terms of roads for somebody who's skeptical, not out of hostility, but just out of a lack of imagination? Somebody who would say, I can understand how you could make the typical consumer good in a free market because I see how you can earn a profit from it very directly. Somebody purchases the good, you earn a profit, you make more of the good. But with roads, it's going to be somewhat more indirect, because although we know there are toll roads, nobody wants to have a toll every 10 feet, and so therefore no road owner in his right mind would set it up that way. How would it be set up? What would be a plausible way of thinking about how this could work?
Well, with all this stuff, with roads as well as more esoteric things about privately produced goods that people typically associate with the state, again, I just need to remind people, what you need to do is compare the real world in both cases, right? Don't compare a hypothetical perfect state provision from Paul Samuelson textbook with what you think would happen in practice with real world entrepreneurs. So, for example, if you're worried and say, oh man, I don't know, with the profit motive behind everything, I bet you'd have to stop every few miles and pay a toll, and you just see all these billboards with the crassest things. Right, and that's exactly what happens when I drive to my parents' house in Florida on I-75. There's a stretch when I get off on the throughway, or I forget what they call it, down at Turnpike. And it's amazing when I go down to the Orlando airport how many tolls I have to pay, literally like every few miles. And then also I'm just inundated with billboards for strip clubs and all kinds of stuff just going down there. This is the current system. So what people talk about, what would happen under the bad profit motive, that's what happens right now, okay? And the other thing is, people have no idea, or non-economists have no idea just how wasteful it is in major areas when the government charges an inadequate toll, right? So in New York City, for example, every workday there is a huge traffic jam from people going into New York City or into Manhattan and then going back home later in the day, and traffic gets backed up, and there's lawyers and accountants and lots of people whose time is extremely valuable, and they're stuck in traffic for hours when, if there weren't all the other cars there, it would be a very quick, 15-minute ride both ways. And that is fundamentally because there's a shortage, that price charged for the use of those resources is too low. And they do have peak pricing, but it's not peak enough. And the ultimate solution would be if that were all privatized and companies had the ability to build other sorts of ways of getting in and out, then you would not have those huge traffic jams, right? And so it's just mind-boggling when you sit there and multiply and figure out how much productivity is lost from productive workers being stuck in traffic jams every single day, just systematically, institutionally, because the government owns these things and doesn't charge the right price for them.
And again, this isn't even treated as an issue. This is I don't see people talking to us about roads acknowledging any of this. They would probably, if I were to ask them, think that traffic jams are just a force of nature. Because they are a problem occurring on government property, they therefore are a force of nature that have no explanation. I mean, that seems to be the general rule.
Yeah. or if you press them, Tom, they would say, well, you're right, there are deeper causes. The problem is people are greedy and individualistic, and they want to ride in their own little personal fiefdom of a car,
right?
And they don't want to just take the subway like any other decent-minded person would do. And,
that's the usual thing. And the thing is, there are people on the left and the right who, from the start, have hated the car. And for the same reason, because it promotes individual independence. A traditionalist conservative doesn't like that. Stay in your old neighborhood of birth, citizen, and you're going to like it. And then, those who want to impose their blueprints on society can't have people driving around wherever they want. So in contrast to both of those, we libertarians strike that beautiful middle ground of liberty here. Well, Bob, I appreciate your time. I wasn't really sure if we'd be able to sustain this for a whole episode. I don't know why. After so much experience I've had talking to you, we could talk about pretty much anything and get 30 minutes out of it. But thanks a lot.
Well, thanks for having me. And yeah, for people, there were a lot of details you and I glossed over, and so I would encourage people just to go Google Walter Block private roads, and you'll find various, essays of in-depth length or, full book-length treatments and so
Oh, yeah. Oh, you don't have to. I'm way ahead of you. TomWoods.com/316 is the show notes page. I've already got Walter's book linked there. I've got all information about you linked there. The article that we're talking about is linked there. TomWoods.com/316 is the indispensable accompaniment to this episode. Bob, thanks again.
Thanks, Tom.
All right, everybody. Well, I think you can see why I'm so pleased to be adding Bob to my roster of faculty over at libertyclassroom.com this year. We've already got 12 courses, and Bob will be producing some content for us and doing some special live question and answer sessions with us. It's going to be a lot of fun. So if you haven't joined us, now's a good time to do so at libertyclassroom.com using coupon code SHOW in all caps to get a special discount. Of course, make sure you subscribe to this show. I know some people just watch the show. They put it on, we don't have a video feed. We have a still shot. People listen to the show on YouTube, but it's a small fraction of the audience that listens on YouTube. Most people are listening via iTunes or Stitcher because it's a more convenient delivery method, and you can subscribe via iTunes or Stitcher for free, of course, at tomwoods.com or at the show notes page, tomwoods.com/316. Thanks so much for listening, everybody. See you next week.
The Tom Woods Show.